The war had lasted for nearly 300 years, and Princess Calith Vorn could still remember the day. Her oldest sister died in the orbital bombardment that destroyed the northern continent of their homeworld. And she remembered how her father, the Emperor, had stood at the window watching the fires burn across the horizon without shedding a single tear, because Valorians did not cry. They endured, they survived, and they carried their grief like stones in their hearts until the weight crushed them from within. Calith stood now in the diplomatic chamber of Neutral Station Arcturus with her silver skin reflecting the cold artificial light, and her 4 eyes scanning the peace treaty that would finally end the bloodshed between the Valorian Empire and the Galactic Coalition. And she read every word carefully, because she knew that somewhere in this document was a clause that would change her life forever. The Coalition's chief diplomat, an amphibian creature from the water world of Thesan, cleared his throat and gestured toward a section near the end of the treaty. "The marriage alliance," he said in a voice that bubbled with moisture, "is non-negotiable, princess, and the groom has already been selected by our council." Calith felt her stomach tighten, but she did not let her expression change, because showing emotion was weakness, and weakness was death in the courts of the Valorian Empire. "Tell me about him," she said. The diplomat's gills fluttered nervously, and he exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. "His name is Daniel Carter, and he is a captain in Earth's expeditionary fleet, decorated for bravery in 17 engagements, and known among his people as a man of honor and integrity. A human," Calith said, and the word hung in the air like poison. The chamber fell silent, and Calith could feel the tension radiating from every diplomat and advisor present, because humans were the forbidden species, quarantined to a single sector of the galaxy and monitored by automated systems that had been in place longer than most civilizations had existed. And no one was permitted to form bonds with them for reasons that were classified at the highest levels of galactic governance. Her own advisor, an elderly Valorian named Lord Malthan, stepped forward with urgency in his voice. "Princess, you cannot agree to this. The laws regarding humans are absolute, and the consequences of breaking them are severe beyond measure." But Calith had already made her decision, because she had watched her second sister die 3 years ago when the Coalition fleet broke through their defensive lines, and she had held her mother's hand as the old Empress took her final breath, whispering that she hoped Calith would live to see peace. And now peace was here, sitting on the table in front of her, asking only that she give herself to a stranger from Akadas. "Forbidden's world, I accept," she said. Lord Malthan's face went pale, and he tried to protest, but Calith silenced him with a look that carried the weight of 300 years of war and millions of dead Valorians, and a lifetime of watching everyone she loved turn to ash. "Prepare the ceremony," she told the Coalition diplomat. "I will meet my husband." They brought Daniel Carter to her 1 hour before the wedding in a small chamber with windows that looked out on the endless stars. And Calith studied him as he entered, searching for some sign of the danger that supposedly lurked within his species. He was taller than she expected, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead and brown eyes that seemed warm in a way she did not understand. And he moved with a confidence that was not arrogance, but something else. Something she could not name. "Princess Calith," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had anticipated. "I know this situation is not what either of us would have chosen, and I want you to know that I have no intention of treating you as a prize or a prisoner." She tilted her head, curious despite herself. "Then how do you intend to treat me?" He smiled, and the expression was strange to her, because Valorians did not smile. They showed respect through formal gestures and careful words, not through the curving of lips and the crinkling of eyes. "I intend to treat you as my partner," he said. someone I can learn from, and hopefully someone who might learn something from me in return. And above all, I promise to be kind. Kindness was not a concept that held much weight in Valorian culture because kindness was soft, and softness was weakness, and weakness meant death. But there was something in the way Daniel spoke that made Calith want to believe him. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" she asked. "Your people are not at war with mine. You have no stake in this conflict." Daniel's smile faded slightly, and he looked out the window at the distant stars. "Because someone had to," he said. "And I have spent my entire career watching good people die in wars that could have been prevented. So when the coalition asked for a volunteer, I stepped forward because I thought that maybe, just maybe, this could be a chance to do something that actually matters." Calith did not know what to say to that, because she had expected him to speak of duty or obligation or political advantage, not of hope and meaning and the desire to make a difference. The ceremony itself was brief and functional, conducted by a neutral arbiter who spoke the words of binding in a language so old that even the translators struggled with it. And when it was done, Calith Vorn became Calith Carter, and the 300-year war officially ended with the signing of documents and the exchange of diplomatic pleasantries. Afterward, they walked together to the Sunze's docking bay where Daniel's ship waited. A sleek vessel called the Meridian that looked small compared to Valorian warships, but hummed with an energy that suggested hidden power. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked as they stood before the boarding ramp. Calith looked back at the station where Lord Malthan and the other Valorian advisors watched with expressions of barely concealed horror. And she knew that she was leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her people, her culture, her understanding of the universe. "No," she admitted. "But I will go anyway." Daniel nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. That's usually how the important things work, he said. They boarded the Meridian together, and as the ship pulled away from the station and jumped into faster-than-light travel, Calith felt the weight of her decision settling onto her shoulders like a cloak made of iron. She had married a human to end the war, and now she was traveling into the unknown with a man she did not understand. From a species that was forbidden across the entire galaxy, she did not know yet why humans were quarantined or what made them so dangerous that even speaking their name made diplomats nervous. But she sensed that she was about to find out, and somewhere deep in her heart, in a place she had learned to ignore since childhood, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt curious. Life aboard the Meridian was nothing like Calith had expected, and every day brought new surprises that challenged her. Understanding of what a species could be ship was loud in ways that made her uncomfortable. At first, because Valorian vessels were silent places where crew members spoke in whispers and moved through corridors like ghosts. But humans talked constantly, and they laughed and argued, and sometimes they even shouted at each other over small disagreements before embracing moments later as if nothing had happened. "They are so emotional," Calith said to Daniel one morning as they sat in the mess hall, watching two engineers debate loudly about the proper way to calibrate a warp coil. Daniel shrugged and took a sip of the dark, bitter drink he called coffee. "We feel things strongly," he said, "and we have learned that keeping emotions inside usually makes things worse. So we let them out even when it gets messy. On Valorian ships, such behavior would be punished," Calith said. "Discipline is maintained through silence and obedience." "Different approaches," Daniel said without judgment. "Neither one is wrong. Just different." Calith appreciated that he did not try to convince her that his way was better, because she had expected humans to be arrogant based on the warnings she had heard all her life. But Daniel seemed genuinely interested in learning about her culture, even as he shared his own. He gave her a private cabin near his quarters, but did not expect her to share his bed, and he introduced her to the crew with respect. telling them that she was his wife and his partner, and that anyone who treated her poorly would answer to him. Crew accepted her with surprising ease, and soon Keleth found herself spending time with them, learning their names and their stories and their strange human customs. There was Grace Liu, the chief engineer, a small woman with short black hair who worked 18-hour shifts without complaint because she said the ship was like her child, and she could not rest while her child was hurting. And when the main engine developed a dangerous fault, Grace stayed awake for nearly 2 days straight to fix it, refusing food and sleep until the job was done. There was Kevin Park, the ship's medic, a young man with a quick smile and steady hands who ran into a radiation-contaminated section of the ship without hesitation when a crew member was injured during a maintenance accident. And he carried the wounded man to safety on his back, despite the danger to his own health. There was Betty Morris, the ship's cook, an elderly woman with gray hair and warm eyes, who stayed up all night preparing a special meal for the crew after a difficult mission. Not because anyone asked her to, but simply because she wanted to lift their spirits. Skeleth watched these humans, and she could not understand them because everything they did seemed to contradict the basic principles of survival that governed Valorian society. Why do they sacrifice so much for each other? She asked Daniel one evening as they sat in the observation deck watching the stars drift by. Outside the windows, Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering, "Because we love each other," he said. Simply, love is not efficient, Keleth said. It creates weakness and vulnerability, and it leads to poor decisions. Daniel turned to look at her, and his brown eyes held something deep that she could not read. "Maybe," he said, "but it also gives us something to fight for. And in my experience, people who have something to fight for are much more dangerous than people who are just following orders." The words unsettled Keleth, and she found herself thinking about them for days. Afterward, as she continued to observe the crew of the Meridian one night, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since she first learned she would marry a human. "Why are your people forbidden?" she asked as they sat together in the observation deck. Daniel's expression grew serious, and he set down the book he had been reading. "I do not know the full story," he said. "None of us do. The quarantine was established before humanity even achieved faster than light travel, and by the time we reached the stars, we were already labeled as dangerous and confined to a single sector." "But you do not seem dangerous," Keleth said. Studying his face carefully, Daniel laughed softly, but there was something dark beneath the sound. "That is because you have only seen us at peace," he said. "You have seen us when we have nothing to fear and no one to protect. But I have heard stories from the older generations about what humans did during the wars back on Earth. And I have seen recordings of battles where human soldiers did things that should not have been possible." "What kind of things?" Keleth asked. Daniel was silent for a long moment. "Things that made other species afraid," he said finally. "Not afraid of what we might do to them, but afraid of what we were capable of becoming when pushed too far." Keleth did not fully understand what he meant, but she felt a chill run through her body, and for the first time since boarding the Meridian, she remembered that this man beside her, this kind and patient man who had given her space and treated her with respect, belonged to a species that the entire galaxy had decided to lock away. She looked at Daniel with new eyes, and she saw something she had not noticed before. A stillness beneath his warmth, a depth beneath his gentle smile. And she realized that she had only been seeing the surface of what a human could be. "What happens when humans are pushed too far?" she asked quietly. Daniel met her gaze and held it. "I hope you never have to find out," he said. That night, Keleth lay in her cabin unable to sleep, and she thought about everything she had seen and heard since coming aboard the Meridian. The laughter and the arguments and the sacrifice and the love And she thought about Daniel's words and the darkness that had flickered behind his eyes when he spoke of what humans could become. She had married a human to end the war, and she had expected to find a monster in disguise. But instead, she had found something far more complicated. She had found a species that was capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary violence, that loved deeply and fought fiercely, that seemed soft until they were threatened, and then became something that made the entire galaxy tremble. And she had married one of them as she finally drifted off to sleep. Keleth realized that she was no longer just curious about why humans were forbidden. She was beginning to understand that the answer might change everything she thought she knew about the universe. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and Keleth had settled into a routine aboard the Meridian that felt almost comfortable, almost normal, almost like home. She had learned to drink coffee in the mornings with Daniel, and she had learned to laugh at the jokes the crew told even when she did not fully understand them. And she had learned that humans expressed affection through small gestures like a hand on the shoulder or a smile across the room, but she had not forgotten the questions that haunted her, and she had not stopped wondering why her husband's species was forbidden across the entire galaxy. The answer came in the form of an encrypted message that arrived on her personal communication device one evening while Daniel was on the bridge running routine system checks. The message contained no sender identification, only a set of coordinates and a single phrase that made Keleth's heart beat faster. The truth about humans lies in the Vault of Origins. Keleth stared at the words for a long time because she had heard stories about the Vault of Origins since childhood. Whispered tales of a place where the oldest secrets of the galaxy were kept, guarded by beings called the Archivists, who had existed since before the first empires rose and fell. Most people believed the vault was a myth, a legend created to explain the unexplainable. But Keleth had always wondered if there was truth behind the stories. She brought the message to Daniel that night and showed it to him without saying a word. He read it twice and then looked up at her with an expression she could not decipher. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "It could be a trap," Keleth said. "Someone could be trying to lure us into danger." "Probably," Daniel agreed. "But you did not answer my question." Keleth thought about the months she had spent aboard the Meridian and the questions that had grown stronger with each passing day, and the mystery that surrounded her husband's people like a fog that refused to lift. "Yes," she said finally. "I want to know the truth." Daniel nodded as if this was exactly what he expected. "Then let us go find it," he said. The journey to the coordinates took 6 weeks, and the crew of the Meridian grew nervous as they traveled deeper into uncharted space, passing through regions that appeared on no star maps and encountering phenomena that defied explanation. Finally, they arrived in a place where a dying red star pulsed weakly in the darkness, and hidden in the gravity well of that ancient sun was a station unlike anything Keleth had ever seen. It was old, impossibly old, and it seemed to be made of materials that shifted and changed when viewed from different angles. And as the Meridian approached, Keleth felt a presence brush against her mind like a whisper from beyond the stars. "The Archivists," Daniel said quietly. "They are scanning us." The airlock opened and beings of pure light emerged to greet them, formless and beautiful, communicating through harmonic frequencies that the ship's translator struggled to interpret. "Californ Carter," the lead archivist said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You seek knowledge that has been hidden for 11,000 years. "Yes," Keleth said. "I seek the truth about humans." The archivists turned their attention to Daniel, and something like surprise rippled through their luminous forms. "You are the first human to enter this place in 11,000 years, they said. "The last one changed everything. Daniel frowned at this but said nothing as the archivists led them into the station. Through corridors that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Past chambers filled with artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen. Before the current era began finally, they reached the heart of the vault. A vast chamber where holographic records floated in the air like ghosts. And the archivist gestured for Caleth and Daniel to approach. "Watch," they said, "and understand." The records activated and Caleth saw history unfold before her eyes. 11,000 years ago, the galaxy had been ruled by an empire called the Dominion of Ash. A tyrannical civilization that had enslaved hundreds of species and exterminated dozens more. And their cruelty had known no bounds. Then humanity emerged from their small blue planet on the edge of the galaxy. A young species just beginning to explore the stars. And the Dominion of Ash saw them as another resource to be exploited. The records showed what happened next, and Caleth watched in silence as the story unfolded. Humans did not surrender. When the Dominion came for them, and they did not negotiate. And they did not beg for mercy. Instead, they fought back with a ferocity that the galaxy had never seen before. The records showed human soldiers continuing to fight after, suffering wounds that should have been fatal, continuing to advance even as their bodies failed them, continuing to protect their families and their homes until their last breath left their lungs. The record showed human strategists adapting to every tactic the Dominion employed, learning and evolving and finding weaknesses that no one else had noticed, turning the enemy's strength against them with a creativity that bordered on madness. The record showed humans sacrificing themselves by the thousands to save their fellow soldiers, throwing themselves into danger without hesitation, dying so that others might live. And over the course of 2 centuries, humanity dismantled the Dominion of Ash completely, freeing every enslaved species and destroying the empire so thoroughly that barely any record of it remained. Caleth felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched the final battles, as she saw human warriors standing against impossible odds and refusing to break. And she understood for the first time what Daniel had meant when he spoke of what humans could become. But then the records showed something unexpected. When the war ended and the Dominion of Ash was destroyed, humanity did not claim dominion over the species they had freed. They did not demand tribute or territory or recognition. Simply went home to their small blue planet and asked to be left alone. The newly freed species, still reeling from what they had witnessed, gathered together and made a decision that would shape the galaxy for the next 11,000 years. They built the quarantine knot to protect themselves from human aggression. Caleth realized with a shock that ran through her entire body, but to ensure that no one ever gave humanity a reason to fight like that again. Humans were not forbidden because they were monsters. They were forbidden because the galaxy was terrified of what would happen if they ever had to become monsters again. The records faded and Caleth stood in silence beside her husband, processing everything she had learned. "Now you understand," the archivists said. Caleth looked at Daniel and saw that his face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. And she realized that he had not known this history any more than she had. "We ended a galactic tyranny," he said quietly, "and they locked us away for it." "They locked you away because they were afraid," Caleth said. "Afraid of your love and your loyalty and your willingness to die for each other." She took his hand in hers and held it tightly. "They locked you away because they did not understand that your greatest weapon was not your strength or your adaptability or your ferocity." She looked into his brown eyes and saw the same kindness that had drawn her to him from the beginning, the same warmth that had made her feel safe aboard the Meridian. And she understood at last what made humans truly dangerous. "Your greatest weapon was that you cared," she said. Caleth returned from the Vault of Origins, changed in ways she could not fully describe, and she looked at Daniel differently now, seeing the weight he carried without knowing it. The legacy his species bore like an invisible crown. The Meridian made its way back toward Coalition space, and for a few weeks everything seemed peaceful. The crew going about their duties with their usual laughter and arguments. Daniel spending his evenings with Khalith in the observation deck, talking about the future they might build together. But peace, as Khalith had learned long ago, was always fragile. The attack came without warning 6 months after their wedding. As the Meridian passed through a sector of neutral space that should have been safe Valorian warships, dropped out of faster-than-light travel and surrounded them. Weapons powered and targeting systems locked. And a voice came over the communication channel that made Khalith's blood run cold. "This is Commander Zorath of the true Valorian resistance," the voice said. "We do not recognize the treaty signed by the traitor emperor, and we demand the immediate surrender of the false princess who has shamed our people by bonding with a human." Khalith knew of Zorath, a fanatic who had opposed the peace treaty from the beginning, and who believed that the war should continue until every coalition species was destroyed. And she understood immediately that he had no intention of letting her live. The Meridian was outgunned and outnumbered. A single ship against 5 Valorian warships. And Daniel ordered evasive maneuvers, but it was already too late. The first volley tore through the Meridian shields and ripped open the hull, killing crew members Khalith had come to consider friends. And the second volley disabled the engines and left them drifting helplessly in spaceboarding pods attached to the ship's hull, and Valorian soldiers poured through the breaches, overwhelming the crew with superior numbers. And Khalith fought alongside Daniel until they were separated in the chaos. She saw him fall when a plasma blast caught him in the chest, saw him hit the ground with blood spreading across his uniform. And she screamed his name before something struck her from behind, and the world went dark. When Khalith woke, she was in a cell aboard Zorath's flagship, her wrists bound with energy restraints, and the commander himself stood before her with contempt burning in his 4 eyes. "The human is dead," he said, "as all humans should be, and soon you will join him as a traitor to your people." Khalith felt something break inside her at those words. A wall she had built around her heart since childhood crumbling to dust. And for the first time in her adult life she wept. Open Lizareth laughed at her tears and left her alone in the darkness, but Daniel was not dead. The plasma blast had broken 7 of his ribs and punctured one of his lungs and burned across 40% of his body. But he was still breathing when Kevin Park found him in the wreckage of the Meridians. Corridor Kevin dragged him to the medical bay, one of the few sections of the ship that remained intact, and worked desperately to stabilize him while the surviving crew gathered in what remained of the engineering section. There were 12 of them left, 12 humans out of a crew of 60, and they were injured and exhausted. And trapped on a crippled ship with no hope of rescue, Daniel regained consciousness 3 hours after the attack, and the first words out of his mouth were a question: "Where's Khalith?" Kevin tried to keep him in the medical bed, but Daniel pushed him away and forced himself to stand even though the pain made him want to scream. And he limped to the engineering section where the surviving crew had gathered grace. Liu looked up when he entered, and her face showed relief and fear in equal measure. "Captain, you need to rest. Your injuries are severe, and if you push yourself too hard, you will die. Where is my wife?" Daniel asked again. Grace hesitated before answering. "They took her, Captain. Zorath's forces boarded us and took the princess, and they left us here to die." Daniel closed his eyes, and Khalith had once asked him what happened when humans were pushed too far, and he had hoped she would never have to find out. But now, standing in the ruins of his ship with his wife in the hands of a fanatic who intended to execute her, Daniel felt something shift inside him, the warmth that had defined him since she met him. The kindness and patience and gentle humor, all of it seemed to drain away. replaced by something cold and hard and utterly focused. "They took my wife," he said, and his voice was flat in a way that made even Grace take a step back. Kevin stepped forward with concern in his eyes. "Captain, even if we could get the ship moving, we are 12 people against a warship with 200 soldiers. This is not a fight we can win." Daniel looked at him with eyes that had gone empty and dark. "I did not ask if we could win," he said. "I said they took my wife." He turned to face the surviving crew, his body broken but his will unshattered. And something in his expression made them all straighten despite their own injuries. "I'm going to get her back," Daniel said. "And I'm going to kill every single person who stands between us. Anyone who wants to help me is welcome. Anyone who wants to stay here and wait for rescue is free to do so. But I am leaving in 1 hour. No one chose to stay, Grace." Jury rigged the emergency thrusters to give them enough mobility to approach Zorath's flagship. And Kevin gathered what medical supplies remained. And the other survivors armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. They launched from the Meridian in emergency pods. 12 humans hurtling through space toward a warship that could have destroyed them with a single shot. But Zorath was so confident in his victory that he did not bother to activate his point defense systems. The pods attached to the flagship's hull, and Daniel was the first one through, burning his way through the airlock with a cutting torch and stepping into the enemy vessel with a weapon in each hand. What followed would later be classified by Valorian military historians as the incident at Marker 7, and the recordings would be studied by analysts from every species in the galaxy who struggled to understand how it was possible. 12 humans moved through the flagship like ghosts made of violence, using the ship's own systems against it, disabling power to sections and sealing doors to isolate squads of soldiers, picking off enemies one by one with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. Daniel led them through the corridors, following his instincts toward the detention level, and every Valorian who stood in his way fell before him. And he did not stop even when he took wounds that should have slowed him down, did not pause even when his body screamed for rest, did not hesitate even when the odds seemed impossible. Keyleth heard the gunfire getting closer, heard the screams of Valorian soldiers dying in the corridors outside her cell. And she did not know what was happening until the door exploded inward and Daniel stood in the opening. He was covered in blood, most of it not his own, and his eyes were still cold and empty. But when he saw her alive and unharmed, something flickered back to life behind them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. Keyleth shook her head. Unable to speak, Daniel nodded once, and then he collapsed, his body finally giving out after hours of running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate need to save the woman he loved behind him in the corridor. Commander Zorath lay dead with the rest of his soldiers, and the flagship of the true Valorian resistance belonged to 12 humans who had refused to let their captain's wife, Keyleth, caught Daniel before he hit the ground, and she held him in her arms as Kevin rushed forward to treat his wounds. And she finally understood what she had married: not a monster, not a forbidden species, just a man who loved her enough to become something terrifying in order to bring her home. Daniel spent 3 weeks in a medical coma while his body struggled to heal from wounds that should have killed him. And Keyleth never left his side except when the doctors physically forced her to. Eat and rest, she sat beside his bed in the medical station where they had brought him after the surviving crew of the Meridian piloted Zorath's captured flagship to the nearest coalition outpost. And she held his hand and talked to him even though he could not hear her. She told him about her childhood on Valoria, about her sisters who had died in the war, about the mother who had whispered hopes for peace with her final breath. She told him about the fear she had felt when she first learned she would marry a human, and the curiosity that replaced that fear, and the love that had grown slowly in her. hard like a flower blooming in an unexpected place. She told him that she was proud to be his wife, while Keleth kept her vigil. The story of what had happened spread across the galaxy like wildfire, traveling through communication networks and diplomatic channels until every species knew what 12 humans had done aboard. Zorath's flagship military analysts studied the recordings from the ship's security systems, and they tried to understand how it was possible. How a handful of wounded humans had defeated 200 trained Valorian soldiers. They watched Daniel move through the corridors with wounds that should have left him unconscious. Watched him fight with a speed and ferocity that seemed to defy the limits of biology. Watched him refuse to fall even when his body had every reason to give up. They could not explain it. Human combat behavior did not fit any known models, and human endurance exceeded all predictions, and human determination seemed to operate according to rules that the rest of the galaxy did not understand. "They are not like us," one Valorian general said in a classified briefing. "When we are wounded, we slow down, but when they are wounded, they seem to become more dangerous. As if pain and fear do not affect them the way they affect normal species. That is not accurate," a human psychologist responded when asked to explain. "We feel pain and fear just like everyone else. But we have learned to keep fighting anyway, because the people we love are more important than our own survival." The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what had happened, and representatives from every major species gathered in the Great Chamber on Thason to debate the implications of the incident. At Marker 7, there were calls to strengthen the quarantine, to increase the restrictions on human travel, to ensure that no human ever had a reason to fight like that again. Keleth attended the session as the Valorian representative because her father, the Emperor, had asked her to speak on behalf of their people. And she sat in silence as the delegates argued back and forth about what should be done. Finally, she stood, and the chamber fell quiet because everyone wanted to hear what the woman who had married a human would say. "You are afraid," she said, and her voice carried through the great chamber without wavering. "I understand why. Because I have seen what humans can do when someone they love is threatened. And it is terrifying." She paused and looked around at the assembled delegates, at the amphibian Thesans and the crystalline Vorthi and the insectoid, Krell and all the other species who had built civilizations among the stars. "But you have misunderstood them," she continued. "You have looked at their capacity for violence and concluded that they are dangerous weapons waiting to be unleashed. But that is not what they are." She thought about Daniel lying in the medical bay, about the kindness he had shown her from their first meeting, about the patience with which he had answered her endless questions, about the love that had grown between them despite the impossible circumstances of their marriage. "Humans are not weapons," she said. "They are people who love deeply and sacrifice freely and fight only when they must. And yes, they are capable of terrible violence, but that violence is not who they are. It is what they become when everything else has been taken from them." She stepped forward, and her silver skin caught the light of the chamber. "My husband nearly died to save me," she said. "Not because I am a princess, not because of politics or treaties, not because of any strategic calculation, but because he made a promise to be kind and he meant it. And when I was taken from him, he did not stop to consider whether the odds were in his favor. He simply came for me because that is what humans do for the people they love." The chamber remained silent as she spoke. 11,000 years ago, humanity freed the galaxy from the dominion of Ash, she said. "And in return, you built a cage around them because you were afraid of what they might become. But fear is a poison that destroys both the one who fears and the one who is feared." She looked directly at the Thesan who had arranged her marriage, the same diplomat who had sat across from her in the negotiation chamber all those months ago. "The quarantine was built on fear," she said, "and I'm asking you to let it go. Not because humans are harmless. they are not, but because keeping them isolated means we lose the chance to learn from them, to grow alongside them, to understand that love and loyalty and sacrifice are not weaknesses to be controlled, but strengths to be celebrated. She took a breath and delivered her final words. I married a human to end a war. And what I discovered is that his kind is not forbidden because they are dangerous. They are forbidden because we were not ready to accept what they represent. She turned and walked back to her seat, and the chamber erupted in debate. Delegates arguing passionately about what should be done. But Caliph did not listen, because her mind was already elsewhere. Daniel woke 2 days later. Caliph was holding his hand when his eyes opened, and the first thing he saw was her face looking down at him with tears streaming from all four of her eyes. Hey, he said, and his voice was rough from weeks of silence. Hey, she said back, and she laughed through her tears. Did we win? He asked. We won, she said. The council voted to begin dismantling the quarantine. It will take time, but humanity will be free to rejoin the galaxy. Daniel smiled weakly and squeezed her hand. All that because 12 people refused to give up? He asked. Caliph leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of affection she had learned from watching human couples aboard the Meridian. All that because one man loved his wife enough to fight for her, she said. Outside the medical bay window, the stars stretched on forever. The same stars that had watched humanity emerge from their small blue planet all those thousands of years ago. The same stars that had witnessed the fall of the Dominion of Ash and the building of the quarantine, and now the first steps toward its end. Somewhere among those stars, a new era was beginning. An era where humans would no longer be forbidden but welcomed. Where the galaxy would learn to see them not as monsters to be feared, but as people to be understood, and at the center of it all were a Valorian princess and her human husband. Two people from different worlds who had found each other across the void and discovered that love was more powerful than fear, that kindness was stronger than cruelty, and that sometimes the most forbidden things turn out to be exactly what the universe needs. Caliph kissed Daniel's forehead and held him close. I am glad I married you, she whispered. I'm glad you did too, he whispered back, and somewhere in the distance a quarantine that had lasted 11,000 years began, slowly and inevitably, to lift.